What if a single day could transform an entire nation's destiny? A seemingly ordinary date that became the worst nightmare of an empire. A story of courage that few know, but which forever changed the course of history, echoing the universal human spirit of resistance. Picture a country completely dominated, its culture suffocated, its identity slowly being erased. This was Korea's reality in the early 20th century, under the ruthless grip of the Japanese Empire. But not everyone was willing to accept this fate. On March 1st, 1919, something extraordinary happened. This wasn't a conventional war, not a battle with tanks or planes. It was something far more powerful. The collective force of a people united by a single ideal of freedom. The Korean independence movement, known as Samiljeol, was more than a historical event. It was a collective cry of resistance, a moment when ordinary citizens, students, merchants, religious leaders decided they would no longer accept silent oppression. That day, more than protests occurred. An entire nation awakened to its own dignity. Thousands took to the streets, challenging a militarily superior power, completely unarmed but infinitely courageous. Reminiscent of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance in India or the civil rights movements that would later emerge globally. What few know is how this seemingly improbable movement managed to shake the structures of an empire that appeared invincible. How can a handful of determined people truly change the course of history? This story resonates beyond Korea's borders. It's a testament to human resilience that finds echoes in resistance movements worldwide. From the streets of Soweto to the civil rights marches in Birmingham, the spirit of peaceful resistance knows no geographical boundaries. Prepare to discover a story that transcends textbooks, a narrative of courage that still pulses in the heart of a people. To understand the magnitude of this movement, we must dive into the depths of an occupation that lasted decades. Korea, once a millennial kingdom with a rich tradition, had been completely swallowed by the Japanese Empire in 1910. The domination was not just political, it was total. The Japanese implemented a control system that went far beyond geographical borders. They banned the Korean language in schools, replaced traditional names with Japanese names, and transformed local culture into something almost unrecognizable. Imagine being forced to abandon your own identity. Korean families were compelled to adopt Japanese surnames. Children were prohibited from speaking their mother tongue, and any cultural manifestation was severely repressed. Education became an instrument of domination. Where Japanese history was presented as superior and Korean history was practically erased. Economically, the situation was even more cruel. Lands were confiscated. Peasants transformed into near slaves. An entire economic structure was redesigned to exclusively benefit the colonizers. Koreans were second-class citizens in their own land. This systematic oppression found parallels in other colonial contexts worldwide, much like the British rule in India, the apartheid system in South Africa, or the segregation in the United States. Korea experienced a comprehensive strategy of cultural and economic subjugation. But not everything was silence. Intellectuals, religious leaders, and young students began to articulate resistance. Influenced by the ideals of self-determination proclaimed by U.S. President Woodrow Wilson after World War I, they saw a window of hope. The world was changing. Colonial empires were beginning to crumble, and the desire for freedom was growing like a flame that could no longer be contained. In Korea, this flame found fuel in decades of humiliation and oppression. Drawing inspiration from global resistance movements, the nonviolent protests of Gandhi, the intellectual resistance of African anti-colonial leaders, the persistent struggle of indigenous peoples worldwide, Korean resistance was taking shape. It was in this call to attention to repressed hope and emerging courage that the March 1st movement began to be gestated. It would not be just a protest, but a movement that intended to restore dignity to an entire nation. How would the seed of resistance transform into a movement that would shake an empire? The answer was about to be written in the streets, in the squares, in the heart of every Korean. Everything began behind the scenes, far from Japanese surveillance. A select group of leaders, intellectuals, religious figures, students, began weaving a resistance network that would be more powerful than any military force. At the center of this articulation were 33 Korean leaders, representatives from different sectors of society. They met secretly, knowing each encounter could mean imprisonment or death. Among them were figures like Chung Chul-woo, a Protestant pastor, and Kim Jae-yun, a brilliant lawyer who understood that freedom must be conquered with intelligence and strategy. Their movement echoed global resistance strategies, like the underground networks of the French resistance during World War II, or the clandestine organizing of anti-apartheid activists in South Africa. These Korean leaders understood the power of strategic, coordinated resistance. The document that would be the revolution's fuel was prepared with surgical precision. The Korean Declaration of Independence was not just a text. It was a manifesto of hope, written in Hangul, the Korean alphabet, which the Japanese were trying to prohibit. The document was a declaration of existence. Their organizational strategies were complex. They used an almost clandestine communication network, passing information through messengers, using codes and secret meetings. University students, especially, became the messengers of the silent revolution. Inspiration came from multiple sources. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points on self-determination of peoples echoed like a call. The 1917 Russian Revolution showed that empires could be challenged. The global independence movements from India to Africa demonstrated that colonial powers were not invincible. The world was changing, and Korea wanted to be part of that change. What once seemed impossible, challenging an empire that appeared unbeatable, was beginning to take shape. It would not be an armed revolution, but something much more powerful. The force of people united by an ideal of freedom. Each distributed leaflet, each secret meeting, each whispered word was a brick being placed in construction of a movement that would forever change the destiny of a nation. The time for action was approaching, and no one, not even the Japanese Empire, could stop them. On March 1st, 1919, Seoul awoke differently. Something hung in the air, an electricity announcing change, reminiscent of the charged atmosphere before other historic global transformations. At 2 p.m., at the Educational Payment Association headquarters, 33 Korean leaders publicly read the Declaration of Independence. It was like thunder breaking the silence of oppression. Students, merchants, religious leaders, all united by a single cry, Manse, long live Free Korea. The streets transformed into a sea of white and red Korean flags. Thousands simultaneously emerged in various cities. In Seoul, Pyongyang, Wonsan, the movement was an unstoppable wave. They were not violent protesters, but determined citizens. Drawing parallels with other peaceful resistance movements, Gandhi's Salt March in India, Martin Luther King's civil rights demonstrations. This was a profoundly nonviolent protest. The power was in unity, dignity, and collective spirit. Entire families participated. Children carrying flags, elderly marching alongside youth. Resistance had no age, no social class. It was a genuinely popular movement. Japanese authorities were initially paralyzed. How could they suppress such a peaceful and massive movement? The strategy was clear: demonstrate dignity without using violence. But the Japanese response would be brutal. Troops began dispersing crowds with extreme violence. Public shootings, mass arrests, summary executions. What was meant to be a peaceful protest transformed into a bloodbath. Estimates suggest over 7,500 Koreans were killed in the first months after the uprising. Another 45,000 were imprisoned. But each death, each arrest, only fueled the flame of resistance further. The movement spread like fire in dry fields. Smaller cities, remote villages, all rose up. It was no longer just a protest. It was a declaration of national existence. Japanese brutality achieved something it never intended, transforming a local protest into a national resistance movement. Each drop of blood spilled was a seed of freedom being planted. This echoed other global resistance moments: the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, the Indian independence movement, the African anti-colonial struggles. Ordinary people standing against seemingly insurmountable oppression. March 1st, 1919 would not just be a date. It would be the moment when an entire nation awakened to its own dignity. The Japanese Empire's response was merciless. What began as a peaceful protest transformed into one of the bloodiest pages in Korean colonial history. The statistics are shocking. Over 7,500 Koreans were directly executed, 45,000 imprisoned, and hundreds of communities were completely destroyed. Schools were closed, community leaders systematically eliminated, and any trace of organization was brutally suppressed. But repression had an unexpected effect. Each death, each imprisonment, each act of violence increased the Korean people's determination. The movement, far from being stifled, gained international dimensions. Foreign newspapers began reporting the Japanese Empire's brutality, exposing the Korean struggle to the world. This resonated with other global resistance narratives, like the international pressure against apartheid in South Africa or the global support for Indian independence. The Korean resistance became a symbol of collective human dignity. The international community, especially the United States and some European powers, began questioning the legitimacy of Japanese occupation. Diplomats sent detailed reports about Korean resistance, creating unprecedented international pressure. In exile, Korean leaders continued organizing resistance. They formed provisional governments, articulated diplomatic strategies, and kept the flame of independence alive. The March 1st movement became a global resistance symbol. The consequences were profound and long-lasting. The Japanese Empire, which seemed invincible, began showing its first cracks. Korean resistance became a model for other colonial liberation movements worldwide. The Korean national identity, far from being destroyed, was strengthened. Each repression act only solidified the feeling of unity and resistance. What the Japanese tried to erase, they only made more brilliant. Parallels could be drawn with other resistance movements. The persistence of Native American tribes, the resilience of African anti-colonial movements, the unwavering spirit of indigenous peoples globally. Years later, in 1945, with the end of World War II, Korea would finally conquer its independence. Those 33 leaders who once declared their freedom became national heroes, symbols of courage and resistance. The cry of Manse continued echoing, stronger than ever, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit of freedom. What happened on March 1st, 1919, goes far beyond a simple resistance movement. It was a moment of national rebirth, a turning point in the history of a people who refused to disappear. Korea taught us a fundamental lesson. Freedom is not granted, it is conquered, not with weapons, but with courage, not with violence, but with determination. Each citizen who took to the streets that day carried something more powerful than any tank or rifle: the dignity of a people. This story resonates with global resistance narratives, from Gandhi's nonviolent protest to Nelson Mandela's struggle against apartheid, from the civil rights movement in the United States to indigenous resistance movements worldwide. Today, when we look at modern Korea, a technologically advanced country with global influence, the birthplace of global pop culture, it's hard to imagine how much those protesters suffered. Every startup in Seoul, every K-pop song, every technological advancement carries within the DNA of those 33 leaders and thousands of protesters. The March 1st movement is not just history. It is a living testimony that hope can overcome fear, that unity overcomes oppression, that a people's identity is stronger than any attempt to silence it. Beyond history books, a question remains: what are we willing to defend? What freedoms are we prepared to conquer? The story continues to be written, and each of us has the power to be its author. In the grand tapestry of human resistance, the Korean story shines as a beacon of unwavering spirit. And you, viewer of Waves of Legend, have you ever imagined how many extraordinary stories are hidden between the lines of history? What you just watched is just a wave, one among thousands of courageous stories that changed the world. At Waves of Legend, our mission is to dive into narratives that traditional history often forgets. Each video is a journey, each story a silent revolution. Want to continue discovering these waves of resistance, of transformation, of hope? Subscribe to the channel now. Hit that notification bell, because every story we don't know is a part of our own humanity that remains invisible. Waves of Legend, unveiling stories the world needs to know. The next wave is about to arrive. Be prepared.